Every day she felt that it was a waking nightmare, rather every second. She was in her daughter's room with a tear-stained face. A month had gone by with nothing, but a clue would come up that would change everything. Nancy Jacobs knew that moving into another city would be just what she and her family needed. She managed to get hired by a company and her daughter named Cindy got enrolled in a good school in the area. But there was a new spark in her life that she didn't see coming. She needed to get her and her family away from her husband's family at all costs. Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story. On her side, her divorced parents were bitter people who couldn't go more than 5 minutes without arguing or trying to make her choose a side in their petty fights. But on her husband's side, things were just as bad, if not worse. Her husband's mother-in-law had a lot of problems, but chief among them was her control issues. Everything always had to go her way, and to make matters worse, her husband, her father-in-law, was stuck up too. They felt that Nancy was holding their son back. She needed to move away from them. The day started out just as any regular did. She hugged her little girl and handed her lunch, and she left through the front door and kissed her husband on the cheek as he followed. But once her husband walked through the door at 3 o'clock without her, she knew things would never be the same again. "Where's Cindy? I thought you were picking her up." He looked at the floor in shame. "The school said you did." Nancy didn't ask anymore and just grabbed her phone to call 911. But things would only take a darker turn. The calls didn't stop at 911. They called everyone they knew, but no matter who they called, it ended the same, with a shrug of the shoulders. Police arrived immediately since missing children reports are a high priority. Nancy couldn't believe her baby was missing and had been crying the entire afternoon. No one knew anything about her missing girl. After a few days, she only had nightmares of where her poor girl could be. It plagued her mind, and she barely got any sleep. It was a nightmare that every parent feared, except it was a reality for them. Their friends would come to see how they were doing, but many blamed them for terrible parenting. After a month, she felt like a husk of her former self. Her entire world had crumbled beneath her feet. What was the point in going on when her daughter was missing? Every time the phone rang, she jumped, but it was more often than not her mother-in-law. She would pass the phone to her husband, where she could hear her chastising them through the phone. His furrowed brow popped up in a surprise. What he said next made her heart beat a mile a minute. "What was that?" "No," in the background. "No, it's nothing. Do you have her?" Nancy couldn't breathe. The truth finally came out. Nancy gripped her phone for dear life as her husband dared to run as many red lights as possible. The tiny voice on the other end of the phone was enough to make them call the cops. And by the time they arrived and saw the flashing lights and their little girl wrapped in a colorful blanket, they cried with happiness. She was okay. But what had happened? The story unfolded like something out of a movie. Her mother-in-law yelled at the cops, calling them every name under the sun. She sneered how Nancy was an unfit mother and their granddaughter was better off with them anyway. Her father-in-law tried to keep her quiet as he called their lawyer. The mother-in-law had showed up at school and picked her up, somehow circumventing the parent checks the teacher had put in place. Their little Cindy had no idea what was going on. All she knew is that Grandma was there to take her for a long visit. The woman's fury was unbridled as she lashed out at Nancy for ruining her son's life and at her son for abandoning his mother. She was a grandmother and had every right to take her granddaughter for visits whenever she wanted. Nancy held her daughter tight and bawled into her husband's arms. The crazy woman had lied right to their faces about their daughter. The cops also discovered she had made a copy of their house key. Apparently, she had even gone as far as to look for new schools for Cindy, ones that were in their old city and where the grandparents lived. This was just the tip of the disturbing iceberg. Through the course of the coming investigation, several troubling details came to light. The first revolved around her father-in-law. His story was that his wife said Cindy would be staying with them for a while because Nancy and her husband just couldn't cope, as if having a child was too much for them and Grandma was there to rescue them. Nancy watched her husband's face morph from disbelief to utter revulsion. As if the story wasn't bad enough on its own, the fact that his father didn't question the situation whatsoever. In fact, he had uttered a strongly worded, "See, I was right," in his mind. It was the first step to freeing his son from benign responsibilities and poor choice of wife he shouldn't have got himself into in the first place. However, it would be at the trail that Nancy and her husband would have to use every ounce of self-control not to sprint across the courtroom and batter the horrible grandparents with the Bible they had sworn on. The pair took the stand in turn and the horrible drama continued. There were arguments of grandparents' rights that were countered with the fact that no parental consent had been given. They claimed that they had been told they could visit any time, which was a blatant lie, and in their minds it was every allowance to do what they did. But when Cindy was asked to tell what she had seen and heard, Nancy couldn't control her tears any longer. The courtroom had been emptied to the bare minimum of participants. Even with the gentle words and coaxing smile from the judge, Cindy sat at the stand looking lost and scared. The questions were simple. Why did Grandma say you had to stay with them? Would be the final nail in the grandparents' coffin. Cindy's eyes darted around the room, and her own tears quickly formed. Grandma said, "Mom and Dad didn't want me." Nancy slumped into her husband's arms. How could two people be so completely vile? They had kidnapped their child, lied about it right to their faces, and on top of it all, play emotional games that even an adult would have a hard time enduring. As if things weren't already unbearable, Nancy's parents had shown up and lurked near the back of the courtroom, ready to accuse her of making the worst possible choice in a husband. It seemed the war had extended all the way to the peripherals of the family unit. But what would be the final outcome? Even if the judge didn't give his personal comments on the matter, the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He was as disgusted as Nancy. The sentence came down, the satisfying results. Not only would there be jail time for the mother-in-law, but a restraining order for both of them. They sat at the opposite table fuming. Nancy and her husband took Cindy from the courtroom, still feeling the weight of the events. But at least there was a fitting end to it all. It would take a long while to recover, but they were ready to move forward. The last matter left to deal with was the school and those that had skimmed over the very clear policy in place. The teacher in question was suspended and the rest of the facility given in-depth reminders of procedure and what could happen if those rules were ignored. But the crazy mother-in-law wouldn't be in jail forever. She would eventually get out, and there was no way of knowing if she would stay away. So there was one final thing to do. The first was a code word, something that only the three of them knew, and if anyone tried to pick up Cindy and didn't know it, she knew to call for help. Next, Nancy went nuts at the electronics store. She set up cameras everywhere. There wasn't an entrance or window that wasn't covered. After the hellish month of thinking the worst had happened, no one could blame the family for making sure it would never happen again. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with someone who may find it interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.